Any pirate enthusiast is familiar with William Kidd, though some would argue he wasn't a pirate. In fact, entire books have been written trying to vindicate his reputation. He is most famous for the ill-fated privateering voyage, during which he captured only 3 prizes, one being a fishing boat, allegedly buried his treasure, and ended with his hanging. But did he deserve it? William Kidd was born in 1654 in Dundee, an impoverished port town in Scotland. His father died at sea when he was 5, and his mother struggled. He ran off to sea sometime in his early teens, shortly after his mother remarried. Whilst we do have a portrait of Kidd's likeness, we don't know if it was actually made during his lifetime. The alleged painter ended his apprenticeship in 1704. Kidd died in 1701. 19th century painter Howard Pyle began the tradition of depicting Kidd as a swarthy, mustachioed man with a black hat and a red sash, and this visage has been adapted by later painters like Ferris, and video games like Sid Meier's Pirates and Pirates of the Burning Sea. I think the older portrait does a better job at capturing Kidd's character. Like most successful men in the period, he wears a wig. We do know that he was a tall and strong man with a quick temper and arrogant streak. The arrogance is certainly on display in the portrait. There's an adventurous gleam in his brown eye, a slight smirk on the lips, and by perching his brows, he's almost scrutinizing or looking down upon the viewer from his commander's stand on the quarterdeck. Kidd began his sailing career alternating between piracy and privateering. We don't know about any of his exploits until 1689. He had signed aboard a French pirate ship named the St. Rose. She made several successful ventures against the Spanish and Dutch. But when England joined the war against France, and the St. Rose set her bow for English waters, Kidd had enough. Together with 7 other Englishmen, he mutineered. They cut the Frenchmen's throats and took the ship for themselves. Now truly called Captain Kidd, he entered the port of Nevis as a hero and a patriot. The governor had the ship renamed Blessed William, apparently in honor of the king, just a coincidence that he shared the same first name as William Kidd, I'm sure. But the ship's company soon tired of Kidd and his pompousness. He was never a good commander of men. One night in port, they snuck aboard the Blessed William and stole her away. The leader of the mutineers was the 22-year-old Robert Culliford. He'd become Captain Kidd's lifelong rival, and having chosen entirely different tracks in life, those paths would cross again one day. Pirate and pirate hunter. Kidd was given command of a new ship and sailed off to find Culliford. According to rumor, he and his piratical mutineers were openly walking the streets of New York. But when Kidd arrived, he had missed them by 2 months. Governor Leisler had supported Culliford's pirates, and this didn't exactly put him and Kidd on, good terms. But the wind was about to shift. New York was facing a civil war between Leisler and his designated replacement, Colonel Inglesby. As the conflict escalated, Kidd offered his support to Inglesby. He sailed his ship around the tip of Manhattan Island, where he anchored and trained his guns on the unprotected backside of the fort where Leisler was holed up. The argument was convincing enough, and Leisler surrendered. Kidd had become a local hero. His popularity allowed him to marry the beautiful Sarah Bradley Cox Ort. 21 years of age, she was the wealthiest widow in town, and the marriage made Kidd one of the most influential men in the city. They moved into a 3-story mansion and eventually had a daughter, Sarah. Their relationship seemed good, and Sarah was always supportive of her husband. He eventually retired from privateering and settled for the more quiet life as a merchant captain. But the sea always calls to men of this vocation. They cannot stay peaceful for too long. In 1695, Kidd had tired of the peaceful life, and he sought a commission as a captain in His Majesty's Royal Navy. This idea just shows how naive and arrogant he was. It took years of naval service to become just an officer, let alone a captain, a rank which was only reserved for English aristocrats, not the Scottish sons of dead mariners. A naval commission was out of the question, but a privateering one. France and England were at war, and robbing French ships became both profitable and patriotic. The king also wanted to root out piracy in the Indian Ocean, as they were disturbing trade with the Mughal Empire and the rulers of India. Kidd managed to get in contact with Lord Bellomont, a Protestant Irishman that had recently been ousted from the Irish Parliament. Thus being short on cash, he was very eager to become the mastermind behind Kidd's project. He gathered a consortium of willing investors, consisting of London's most powerful men, including lords, lawyers, and admirals. The most important among these shadowy backers, earning a giant 10% of all the plunder, was the king himself, William III. Whilst privateering was perfectly legal, the scheme itself was a bit shady. The consortium would be allowed to keep any captured pirate ships and goods found aboard without involvement from the Admiralty Court, having to give anything back to the original owners, or provide any paperwork of its existence. Technically, Kidd could notify a pirate of the location of a merchant ship, let the pirates rob it, then capture the pirate and keep the treasure. If Kidd could capture just 2 pirate ships, the investors were looking at a profit worth 10 times their investment. The scariest part of the contract was the performance bond of £20,000. Basically, if Kidd failed his mission, he'd be ruined. Him, his wife, and daughter would likely be put in debtor's prison. Again, this was evidence of Kidd's recklessness. He had no intentions of failing, and probably didn't even think he could. £8,000 were raised to fit out a ship, the Adventure Galley. A galley ship, propelled by either a bank of oars or her full rigging, she was constructed in a mere 5 weeks. It is possible that she was a former merchant galley refitted for privateer service. Either way, the construction time may have been too quick. Despite her being a perfect privateer on paper, practice would prove her serious flaws. Aboard the Adventure, Kidd returned to New York with pomp and trumpets. On his way home, he had captured his first prize, a fishing boat crewed by 4 Frenchmen. You might think that every sailor in town would be eager to join him. New York was a nest of pirates, after all. Kidd waited and waited. 1 week, 2 weeks. No one wanted to sign aboard. The problem was payment. There were no wages. The crew were only paid from the ships they could catch, and these could only be pirates or Frenchmen, in the Indian Ocean specifically. A big sea, very far from New York. And the crew would only get 1/4 of the plunder, to then split among them. The rest of the money was going to the investors. So Kidd decided to do something radical. He went against his contract, announcing that the crew would now be paid in 3 shares. Now, men from across the eastern seaboard flocked to join his crew. They were a ragtag bunch of troublemakers and degenerates, old pirates. Some of them had even been part of Culliford's mutineers. Amongst them was William Moore. At 18 years of age, he had been imprisoned for assaulting his captain. But for some reason, Kidd believed he could control this unruly crew, and even appointed Moore as his ship's gunner. Let's spend a moment taking the scale of Kidd's mission. As a privateer, he was distrusted by both the Royal Navy and the East India Company. In the massive Indian Ocean, 28 million square miles, he was supposed to catch at least one of the only 5 active pirates, and return to London within a year, to some of the world's most powerful men. Oh, and his crew were mostly pirates. And the Adventure was leaking. Mutinous sentiment was already growing. When he reached the Cape of Good Hope, Kidd got in some more trouble. He was stopped by a naval squadron, the Commodore asking him to surrender 30 of his crewmen. It was common practice for the English Navy to press gang sailors, sometimes from merchants or privateers. Kidd managed to slip away without the Commodore noticing, but when he did, he was none too happy. He wrote home that Kidd was a pirate in disguise. Within a year, the rumor had spread from Bombay to London. Kidd was told that Madagascar was a pirate utopia, home to 1,500 pirates and a fleet of 17 ships. But when he arrived to see for himself, there was nothing. The pirates that did live there were mostly Maroons that lived in mud huts with the natives. So he sailed instead for the island of Comoros, intending to repair the leaks in his ship. On his way there, he encountered 2 ships and decided to bear down on them. When he realized they were English, he backed off. But the harm was already done. In the English captain's report, he claimed that Kidd had fired upon him. A blatant lie, but one easy to believe once they started stacking. Having repaired and careened his ship, Kidd's crew picked up a pair of French pirates. They led him to the entry of the Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears. Pirates would use it as a launch pad to attack Muslim pilgrim ships. This rampant piracy had caused a strain in relations between the Mughal Empire and British East India Company. For this reason, the company diverted a few of their ships to protect the pilgrims. No one seems certain as to what exactly Captain Kidd wanted in the Red Sea. According to him, he was hunting for pirates. But when he bore down on the pilgrim fleet, flying a red pennant, the East India thought otherwise. Red pennants were both a symbol for English privateers, a sign of authority in a squadron, and a signal for attack. So the pilgrims and their escort fired on the adventurer, and he disengaged. Next to sail to modern-day Daman, for reasons unknown, his crew believed he wanted to catch a straggling pilgrim ship. Again, he kept his intentions mysterious. He met with a ship captained by an Englishman, and for once, the encounter wasn't unfriendly. But while Kidd was treating the captain to a drink, his crew decided to inspect their goods. They started grabbing whatever they wanted, and tortured some of the crew, including 5 Portuguese monks. Kidd was furious and forced the crew to return what they had stolen, but the damage was already done. When the 2 ships parted ways, the monks went straight to Bombay, where they complained to Portuguese authorities. Shortly after, 2 heavily armed ships weighed anchor. The pirate hunter was now being hunted. Meanwhile, 2 deserters from Kidd's company decided to spill the modified beans to the East India Company. They told them that Kidd had stolen money from an English ship. Now there was no doubt that he was a pirate. 2 men were sent to spy on him. One of them was William Mason, a former pirate and an old acquaintance of Kidd. He had been one of the mutineers that had stolen the Blessed William. Mason wrote of Kidd that Kidd carries a very different command from what other pirates used to do, Kidd's commission having heretofore procured respect and awe, this being added to his own strength, being a very lusty man, fighting with his own men on any little occasion, often calling for his pistols and threatening anyone that dares speak of anything contrary to his mind to knock out their brains. This causes them to dread him. They are very desirous to put off their yoke. Whilst Mason certainly wasn't some angel, there was a point to the crew growing discontent. One of the crewmen wrote that only 30 among them were content with their current state of affairs. Anyway, as Kidd was refilling on wood and water, the Portuguese ships came down on him. The adventure weighed anchor, and the chase was on. After a 2-day pursuit, the ships entered a calm, and Kidd used the adventure's oars to outmaneuver the smaller ship and batter her into submission. Whilst the crew wished to plunder her, he refused, and sailed off, triumphantly. As Kidd was turning into the catch-all pirate boogeyman, company reports became darker and darker. Sir Jonathan Geyer wrote how Kidd had been at the Laccadive Islands, ravishing and murdering men, women and children, and acted all the villainies possible. These reports were elusive, exaggerated, and contained only bits of truth. Of course, Kidd landed on islands like these to resupply. In one incident, one of his crewmen got killed over a local woman. The perpetrator was hunted down and killed. A later report stated that Kidd had then burned all the huts belonging to unhelpful locals. If this was true, it wasn't any worse than the actions of the company, who stole away fishing supplies, thus depriving the natives of their only means of nourishment, or kidnapped men, women and children to discourage natives from welcoming pirates. Obviously, the company refused to trade with Kidd. Since they controlled every English outpost in the area, it made it hard for him to resupply. His bad temper got the worst of him. After one captain refused to trade with him, Kidd said that the captain deserved to have his ship burned, and that he would make the incident known at Whitehall, once he was back in London. When Kidd was treating a friendly Dutch captain to dinner, William Moore and his buddies grabbed their weapons. Having heard of wealthy passengers aboard the Dutchman, they wanted to plunder it. Kidd was alerted by a loyal crewman, and went up deck to confront the scoundrels. William Moore told Kidd that he had ruined them, and announced a vote on whether they should plunder the ship or not. 2/3 voted aye. Kidd refused. I don't know what he said exactly, but owing to his foul temper backed up by his impressive physique, the crew backed down. That wasn't the end of it. When the Adventure encountered another Dutchman, again, Kidd refused to attack her. Mutiny was in the air. Kidd wanted to punish Moore, but whilst the article stated that the man that shall breed a mutiny riot on board a ship or prize shall lose his shares and receive such corporal punishment as the captain and major part of the company shall deem fit. as in, Kidd could not do it without a majority vote, which was in Moore's favor. Moore proposed an interesting plan to Kidd, in which they would welcome the Dutchmen aboard, take them prisoner, and force them to sign a contract, in which they would agree, to hand over all of their cargo. Kidd called the plan Judas-like and refused. They started arguing. The argument broke into insults. Moore said that Kidd had ruined them. Kidd called him a dog, took up a bucket, and smashed it into his head. The next day, William Moore was dead from a skull fracture. When Kidd next approached a company fort, they opened fire. As a response, he hoisted a flag of France and gave a parting shot. A cabin boy jumped overboard and swam ashore. He told the company that Kidd had shot his quartermaster and that mutiny was afoot. Moore wasn't shot, and he wasn't a quartermaster. On the 18th of November, 1697, the Adventure finally caught her first prize. The 150-ton Rouparel was a Mughal-owned ship carrying Dutch cargo, but since she presented a French passport, the maritime laws of the time made her a legitimate capture. Kidd kept the Rouparel as a consort, but since the crew couldn't really pronounce her name, they voted to rename her November. In April of the previous year, a group of Armenian merchants had hired a 350-ton ship, the Quedagh Merchant, owned by a Mughal courtier named Khorji. Whilst her crew were mostly Indian, there were European experts aboard, and they carried passports from the French East India Company. You can probably see where this is going. Flying French colors, Kidd came along the Quedagh and captured her. The procedure was surprisingly polite. Kidd even had a drink with the French captain, whom, being hired, had no stake in the cargo. When the Armenian merchants learned of this, they were furious and demanded the crew fight back. But no one dared. The treasure found aboard was baffling. The cargo of textiles and opium was worth 50,000 pounds, and in the cabin was a chest of gold and gemstones, and a silver jewel box with diamonds and jewels. As far as I know, Kidd kept it for himself, and showed it to no one. But when Kidd learned that an English companyman was aboard, his blood ran cold. This could have severe implications back in London. According to a cabin boy, he offered to sell the ship back for a single piece of 8. The one piece is real, but even when the Armenians offered 2,000 pounds, the crew voted it down. They wanted to keep the treasure. Kidd looked at the French passport. This was a legal price, after all. He couldn't resist. The crew of the Quedagh was put ashore, and the ship kept as a prize. On his way, he robbed a Portuguese galleot, likely as retribution for the previous attack. However, Portugal and England were at peace, so this was a blatant act of piracy. Of course, pirates often deemed attacks on other religions as acceptable, and Kidd's crew had at several points wanted him to attack both Catholics and Muslims. But their opinions didn't make it any more legal in the eyes of the law. He decided to sell off some of his plunder to smugglers, which not only went against his contract, but angered the East India companies. They didn't want illegal trade. Both the Dutch and English sent ships to hunt for him. Needing a refuge, Kidd set sail for Madagascar. He soon wished that he hadn't. When Kidd arrived on Madagascar, he found anchored a large ship belonging to none other than his old friend, Robert Culliford. Since '89, that man had been through hell and back. He had been held captive in an Indian prison, escaped from Siam, and been voted quartermaster of the pirate ship Resolution. He had since become the captain and plundered his way across the Indian Ocean. With his wealth, he had set himself up as a sort of warlord on St. Mary, a pirate's hideout near Madagascar. It was a good life, only downside being that only 20 of his crew remained. The rest had died from disease. For Captain Kidd, this was perfect. He could both complete his mission by capturing a pirate, a successful one at that, and finally get his revenge on this ancient rival. The odds were massively in his favor. He had 3 ships and 115 men, except that they didn't want to. They weren't going to get paid until they got home, and since most of Culliford's crew were New Yorkers like they, chances are they would be shooting at relatives, neighbors, or old friends. 96 of them deserted over to Culliford, leaving Kidd with a motley 15, including a loyal cabin boy, some old men, a few blacks, and his sickly brother-in-law. The mutineers banged on Kidd's door and asked him to give up his money. He told them to come get it. Kidd and the cabin boy had barricaded themselves inside with some 40 pistols and muskets. He was willing to blow up the ship, and they knew he was stubborn enough to do so. In frustration, they burned his journal and the ship's boat, though the latter was luckily saved. Culliford calmed his new crew and ordered them instead to clean up his ship. Taking advantage of the northbound winds, he went a pirating once more in the Indian Ocean, leaving Kidd to rot on Madagascar with a skeleton crew and a leaky ship. Since the Adventure was beyond repair, Kidd had her burned to recover the ironworks. Those could be sold at quite a profit or used in ship repairs, because he had the Cader repaired and rechristened the Adventure Prize. Aboard his new flagship, he set sail, back across the Atlantic. As you might have realized at this point, Kidd was never a great commander of men, but he was an excellent sailor. The journey to America took only 3 months, and the crew of 40 lost not a single man. But when he arrived in the Caribbean, he learned that he and the crew had been declared pirates. Ever since Henry Avery had plundered the Mughal pilgrim fleet, England had been on tense terms with their most important trading partner in Asia, the Mughal Empire. The English took any opportunity to appease Emperor Aurangzeb. Despite Culliford taking a prize worth twice as much as Avery's haul, and 4 times as much as his nemesis, Captain Kidd, Culliford disappeared into history without a word. The East India had no way of capturing that slippery, sexy bastard. Instead, all blame was put on a much simpler syllable, easy to pronounce for the Grand Mogul: Kidd. Meanwhile in London, rumors were spreading that the king himself was involved in a coalition of pirates to fund this notorious rogue. Lord Bellomont and his associates were now very eager to just sweep all of this under the rug. Everyone, everywhere, from the shitting streets of India to the fish and chip shops of Badtithia, were looking for a convenient scapegoat that had easily presented himself through his own blustering arrogance. Kidd sold his plunder and exchanged the Adventure Prize for a well-armed sloop. Next, he set sail for New York, home. Upon arrival, he sent word for his wife, a lawyer, and a smuggler. They were to reach him in absolute secrecy, and the next day, literally everyone in New York knew that he was back in port. Lord Bellomont, the man most responsible for Kidd's commission, had actually become the new governor, and when Kidd reached out to him, he actually seemed sympathetic. But Kidd's wife, Sarah, advised him to be careful, so Kidd went to Garner's Island, where he convinced John Garner to hide his treasure. Kidd was hoping to use his hidden treasure as a leverage in case the governor would betray him. His other leverage was the Adventure Prize itself, safeguarded on the Caribbean island of St. Catharina. Next, he sailed to Boston and met with Lord Bellomont. Negotiations started out decently, but they quickly soured. When Kidd was on his way to confront Bellomont personally at his mansion, he was arrested and thrown in jail together with his crew. With the help of his lawyer, he finished up his account of the voyage, since his journal had been burned by the mutineers. Hindsight reveals that the account was actually quite accurate, only that Kidd had conveniently skipped over the incident in the Red Sea and his robbing of the Portuguese galleot. Kidd made the mistake of trusting Bellomont, thinking he was a gentleman, so he revealed the location of his treasure and the Adventure Prize. It did not save him. Bellomont confiscated the treasure. However, to avoid scandal, he was obliged to ship it all to London. Frustrated, Bellomont wrote the following letter. He has without doubt a great deal of gold, which is apt to tempt men that have not principles of honor. I have therefore to try the power of dull iron against gold, put him into irons that weigh 16 pounds. There never was a greater liar or thief in the world than this Kidd. There was no escape. On an icy day in February, the year of our Lord 1700, Captain Kidd was wrestled out of Stone Prison by 7 men, dragged kicking and screaming aboard a man-of-war, bound for London. Sarah's parting request to the captain was that he'd be kind to her husband. She even gave him a ring, which he was supposed to keep until he brought back her husband. As far as I know, he would keep the ring. Never has a scandal made more noise, said the French ambassador in a secret report to the King of France. Not since the days of Henry Morgan, or more recently, Bartholomew Sharp, had a privateer accused of piracy so dominated the English political scene. The exception was that these men had committed far worse crimes than Kidd, and still got away with it. The problem now was that 4 noblemen, and the king himself, were accused of treason, having hired a pirate to attack friendly nations. The incident was deeply embarrassing, and ironically, the king who had been instated by a revolution now risked losing his head to a second. Since the investors had all been Whigs, the Tories jumped at this opportunity of slander. No one even considered that Kidd might have been a legal privateer. To the Tories, he was a pirate hired by the Whigs, and to the Whigs, he wasn't a pirate hired by them. His fate was decided before he even arrived. Still believing he could make it, Kidd wrote over a dozen letters and had them secretly sewn into his waistcoat. The Marshal discovered them. When Kidd realized all was lost, he finally broke down. He had endured 3 grueling years at sea, mutineers, thirst, intrigues, a winter in a stone prison. As an eyewitness so eloquently put it, he threw a fit. He ranted, cursed, kicked, bloodied the guards, dented the bulwarks around him. Finally, he passed out in a sweating fever. When he awoke and recovered, he gave a piece of gold to the Marshal and told him to send it to his wife. This was the last piece of Captain Kidd's treasure. Kidd was confined to Marshalsea Prison, where he'd spend the last months of his life. Despite the less than favorable confinements, the court found him a tough cookie to crack. Eventually, the armies of lawyers and angry witnesses managed to convict him of pirating 4 ships and the murder of William Moore. The latter was, of course, a dodgy judgment, since captains had murdered men at sea over less. For example, one captain had killed a passenger after the passenger had called the captain's mistress a whore. The trial was then interrupted by an unwanted visitor, the conviction of Robert Culliford. After pirating his way through the Indian Ocean, Culliford had taken the king's pardon and arrived in London. The Marshal didn't care, and he was hauled off to Marshalsea. Though Kidd and Cully had spent nearly 2 years under the same roof, it never appears as though they actually met. Until now. But if Kidd was hoping for his final revenge, he wouldn't get it. Culliford's pirate fortune allowed him to hire the best lawyer in town, and he was acquitted by the court. Kidd saw several visitors before his death. A preacher came, but Kidd did not want to confess. He was visited by one of the Armenian merchants who wanted to know the Queda's whereabouts. Kidd didn't know, but said he regretted the whole affair. Hindsight is a bitch. Speaking of bitches, it was common for convicts awaiting the gallows to have plenty of sex. So common that it was breaking news when a man did it. One newspaper reported that, whilst Captain Kidd was in jail, no woman came near him but his wife's aunt. Indeed, his only pleasant visitors appeared to have been family. He would never see his daughter grow up. Another tradition was for prisoners to have a hearty breakfast and lots of drinking on the day of their execution. All accounts say that Kidd was drunk. His way to the gallows was marred by rants about money and treasure. He was well dressed and, you could say, the life of the party. On his way he received the news of Lord Belmont's death, and he drank a toast to the fate of his old friend. As the hangman pulled the lever, the rope holding Captain Kidd's noose snapped. Another had to be prepared. The incident sobered him up, but I am uncertain of his last words. One account said that he expressed Christian sympathy, another the sorrow over his wife and daughter. All I know for certain is that the rope did not snap a second time.
Come all you young and old, see me die, see me die. Come all you young and old, see me die. You are welcome to my goal, and by it I lost my soul. Come all you young and old, I must die, I must die. Come all you young and old, I must die.
The body of William Kidd was taken down, painted with tar and put inside of an iron cage. The cage was mounted on a gibbet at the harbour entrance of London, as a warning to anyone contemplating the life of piracy. Culliford's legal troubles would continue for the rest of the year. Eventually he ran out of money, but just when Jack Ketch was knocking at his cell door, the court called him as a witness for the trial of his quartermaster. Culliford was no less than eager for some revenge of his own, and unlike Kidd, he got it. Even better, the very same day, he walked out of court a free man. Without a single shilling left of his pirate fortune, he disappeared into the streets of London and the annals of history. What happened to Captain Kidd's treasure? By now, legends in the streets of London said that Kidd had buried £100,000 worth of gold in the beaches of America and Madagascar. But in reality, Kidd's personal share of the loot amounted to only a tenth of that, and had already been confiscated by the authorities. The items were auctioned off, a portion of the profits going to the Armenian merchants, but the Admiralty took the most. Sarah Kidd did only receive word of her husband's death when the authorities came to confiscate her husband's estate. After a lengthy case, the court ruled the property to be hers. By now, she had remarried and would eventually have 4 children. The 4th was named William. Captain Kidd's daughter married a shipbuilder, Joseph Latham, and I do not know if they had any children. So ends the story of Captain Kidd.
My name was Captain Kidd, and God's laws I did forbid, as so wickedly I did as I sailed, as I sailed. So wickedly I did as I sailed.
Huge thanks to my generous channel members and Patreon supporters. In particular, Cole Freer, Max Dweck, 1660, Michaela Jans, Daniel Stryker, Sea-Dog, Randall DeVere, Old Man Said, and Krillov. If you'd like to interact with me or fellow pirate history enjoyers, please check out the link to our Discord server in the video description. Hope to see you there. Cheers!